Hi, and welcome to the 40th installment of the DAB Project. My original plan for this installment was to talk about Iran's acquisition of the F-14 in combination with the Phoenix missile system. But with the happenstance of beginning this installment with the onset of war with Iran, it seemed best to have a closer look at the history of Iran following World War II. So tonight, we'll take a look at Iranian history and how that led to the Iranian purchase of 80 F-14s. We'll take a closer look at the Phoenix in the next installment. Ultimately, the Iranians purchased the Tomcat as a deterrent to Soviet overflights and later in a war with the Iraqis that would last for most of the 80s. When Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi signed the agreement in January of 1974, it was hailed as a strategic Cold War move to counter Soviet influence by strengthening a key U.S. ally. It was seen as a massive, landmark $2 billion transfer of cutting-edge technology, positioning Iran as the only foreign operator of the advanced fighter and a thorn in the Soviet side. Legend would have it that a fly-off between an F-15 and an F-14 at Andrews Air Force Base, organized for the Shah in 1973, was what convinced the Shah that the Tomcat was a superior system. But like any legend, there's much more to it. So following Orson Welles' recitation of John Gillespie's High Flight, we'll take a quick look at modern Iranian history, the folly of weapons sales, and an aircraft sale that still rankles to this day.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long delirious burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Iran is considered as one of the world's oldest continuous major civilizations, having survived in one guise or another for nearly 3,000 years. But for our purposes, we'll begin that history during World War II. You can thank me later. As an event that is now 80 years in the past, and of the 16 million Americans that served, less than 46,000 are still alive. It is easy to overlook and to forget the ebb and flow and dynamics of that period. But let's face it, the history of World War II is usually presented as the war in the Pacific and/or Europe. Moreover, Americans are rarely recognized for their geographic acumen, so most would be forgiven not knowing where Iran is. But for those executing the war, the location and resources of Iran was quite well known and valued. Although not the natural superhighway like the steppes of Russia, Iran nonetheless serves as a vital geographic, cultural, and trade crossroads linking Western Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, as well as connecting the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf. With this in mind, it was concerning to the Soviets and the British that following the German invasion of Russia, the government of Reza Shah Pahlavi expected the Germans to win the war and refused the British and Soviet demands for the expulsion of Germans from Iran in 1941. This would be pretext enough for the two allies to carry out Operation Countenance. In an alphabetical list of operations carried out in this part of the world during World War II, Operation Countenance is squeezed between Operation Corkscrew and Operation Crimson. Major points to anyone that has previous knowledge of any of these three operations. I certainly didn't. What's possibly even less known is that Iran officially declared neutrality at the start of the war. Neutral states in international law are sovereign nations that abstain from participation in armed conflict between other states, with their rights and duties codified primarily in the 1907 Hague Conventions 5 and 13. They must remain impartial, refrain from providing military support to belligerents, and protect their territory from misuse by warring parties. Although being a key player in both conventions, Great Britain failed to ratify either. Russia, on the other hand, did, and surprisingly, the Soviets accepted this going forward. Despite this, Iranian neutrality was not recognized, and the invasion was an undeclared surprise attack. Reza Shah would appeal directly to President Roosevelt, saying, "This invasion brings into war a neutral and pacific country," to which Roosevelt replied with an eloquent and lengthy letter stating, "We have entered upon a very extensive program of material assistance to those countries which are actively engaged in resisting German ambition for world domination." Despite Reza Shah's plea, Operation Countenance successfully carried out its main objectives. First, a crucial supply route known as the Persian Corridor would be secured and provide safe passage for massive flows of supplies, mostly American Lend-Lease goods, to the Soviets. Secondly, the Iranian oil fields were secured and kept from the Germans. And finally was the forced abdication of Reza Shah Pahlavi to be replaced by his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, better known as the Shah of Iran, who the Allies felt would be more pliable to their needs than his father. In his book, Between Two Revolutions, published in 1982, Ervan Abrahamian notes that Shah Reza left behind no little red book, but his policies and reforms indicates his desire for an Iran that would be free of clerical influence, nomadic uprisings, and ethnic differences on the one hand, and on the other would contain European-style educational institutions, westernized women active outside the home, and modern economic structures with state factories, communication networks, investment banks, and department stores. For a ruler coming to power in 1925, particularly in this part of the world, this was forward thinking. And for a ruler that would consistently lock horns with Western powers for self-determination, it seems like a contradiction. Contradiction or not, his abdication in 1941, his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, who replaced him, would follow a similar path. This, despite the Shah's distaste and loathing of his father, who he considered a thuggish Cossack who achieved nothing as Shah. This would not be the case with Mohammad Pahlavi. It's one thing to take power and control. It's another thing to keep power and control. Over the next 38 years until his exile in 1979, the Shah would survive coups, assassination attempts, government insiders who desired closer relations with the Soviets, a disenchanted CIA, exile to Rome to avoid a Western-sponsored coup d'etat, the list goes on. Long story short, through the various Machiavellian twists and turns of those inside and outside Iran, he was able to consolidate his power. By 1963, he was confident enough to launch the White Revolution, which harkened back to his father's desire to westernize Iran, but the Shah took it one step further and allowed women to vote. It would take time, but this would prove the Shah's undoing. Ayatollah Khomeini, who would later depose him following the Shah's exile, preached openly for his overthrow and decried that the fate of Iran should never be allowed to be decided by women. The Shah would have him exiled in 1964. Despite the clerics and mullahs' desire to see him deposed, Iran's economic growth from 1963 to 1978 was unprecedented, seeing growth in all sectors, not just oil. Manufacturing, privatization of state industries, foreign investments, etc., all fueled the economic engine. All well and good, but the Ayatollah Khomeini and those like him were determined to bring down the Shah. Beginning in 1977, anti-government protests that included the communists, socialists, and Islamists would, by the end of 1978, paralyze the country, the economic engine sputtering to a halt. In January of 1979, Pahlavi would go into exile. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned from 14 years of exile to be greeted by 3 million Iranians. Khomeini's consolidation of power was swift and brutal. Khomeini would be Time magazine's Man of the Year, 1979. In 1978, Zbigniew Brzezinski would share with President Carter a CIA assessment, issued in August of 1978, that said, "Not only is Iran not in a revolutionary phase, it isn't even in a pre-revolutionary phase." It wouldn't be until November that Ambassador William Sullivan sent his Thinking the Unthinkable cable that finally recognized that the Shah might not survive. Indeed, the Shah's fall was swift and unexpected, a stalwart pillar of security that maintained stability in the Persian Gulf, particularly after the British forces withdrew in the early 70s, was gone. The importance of this alliance and of the consequences of its fall was reflected in the massive military aid and sales that the U.S. supplied the Iranians from 1963 to 1978. Between 1970 and 1978, Iran was the largest purchaser of U.S. defense equipment, with $6.9 billion in sales. But it would be another American program starting in 1957 that is only now paying dividends, the Atoms for Peace program, that provided Iran with nuclear technology, including a research reactor and weapons-grade enriched uranium fuel that established the basis of their nuclear program. This is the long way around to say that by the time Khomeini came to power, he would inherit a standing army of 400,000 men who were equipped with the best equipment that the U.S. and many others would supply, and most ominously, everything that is needed for nuclear capability. Most concerning to the various arms suppliers was that if the weapons supplied were the best, very few, if any, were dumbed-down systems that were often supplied to lesser allies. Which brings us to our concern, the F-14, its AUG-9 radar system, and the Phoenix missile system it controlled. Satellites have long usurped reconnaissance overflights of enemy territories, but before they became ubiquitous for that purpose, the huge expanse of Russia and its satellites required manned overflights. The last successful U-2 overflight before Francis Gary Powers was shot down in 1960 began its journey in Pakistan and would land hours later in Iran. So sensitive was this flight that the map outlining the U-2's route was redacted from a CIA report until 2013. But this was just one example of Iran's cooperation with the United States Air Force to carry out recon flights. In the late 50s through the 70s, reconnaissance flights would originate from Iranian air bases, some with Iranian crews, some just United States Air Force crews, and often with mixed crews. The U.S. Air Force, other than the U-2, was flying specially modified B-57s that could cruise at 68,000 feet, while the Iranians were initially flying slow propeller-driven aircraft before they received F-86s, RF-5s, and finally RF-4s in 1971. It should come as no surprise that the Soviets were operating their own overflights of Iran, but it would be the introduction of the MiG-25R in the early 70s that caused concern for the Shah and his Air Force. Their F-4s and its Sparrow missiles were ineffective against the MiG. The Shah needed a better solution. With billions in oil money in his pocket and a very receptive ally, he went shopping. As mentioned earlier, whether it's kismet or misfortune, this installment comes in the midst of Iran and the U.S. at war. Either way, the point is that Iran, as evidenced by what's been said already, has been used and abused by world powers for years, decades, even centuries. That being said, the Shah knew that with their geographic position and their relatively stable relationship with the West, Iran had most favored nation status when it came to weapons procurement. For the military-industrial complex, this can be described as one more productive gold mine. For Grumman, this would lead to the infusion of capital they needed to avoid a monetary collapse. It's easy to say that the Tomcat was simply part of the natural progression of Navy cats that Grumman had been producing for years. But their last cat, the F-11F Tiger, had come off the production line in 1959, and its potential successor, the F-11F Super Tiger, had fallen prey to the Lockheed bribery scandal. Whereas the Tiger, despite being supersonic, had been an incremental step up from the F-9F Cougar, the Tomcat was anything but. Just about every system in the Tomcat was revolutionary. The complication of the swing wing and a radar of such complexity and power that nothing like it would be seen in another fighter until the APG-77 was introduced in the F-22 Raptor in 2005. Additionally, the airframe was required to carry 6 large Phoenix missiles and required to land on the carrier while still carrying all 6 of those missiles. Even the heads-up display, the HUD, was unique to the Tomcat, nothing off the shelf. The A and B model HUDs were designed specifically for air-to-air combat and to be projected on the windscreen. I remember well my dad and several other pilots on the project sitting around our dining room table, going back and forth on how and what should be displayed, all the while drawing their ideas on paper. Long story short, Grumman was bleeding money before the Shah put out his feelers for an aircraft that could fend off the Soviets' MiG-25R. As mentioned at the outset of this installment, legend would have it that the Shah's decision to buy the F-14 versus the F-15 came after he saw the 2 aircraft fly demonstration flights at Andrews Air Force Base outside D.C. in early July of 1973. Not exactly. The early development of the Tomcat was plagued by developmental problems and cost overruns that spiked with rampant inflation of the early 70s. The program was in trouble and both Grumman and the Navy were looking for additional customers to share the burden of further development and production. To that end, Grumman had been in contact with the Iranian government and had supplied the Iranians with classified information about the program nearly 2 years before the fly-off. Tom Cooper and Farzad Bishop's book, Iranian F-14 Tomcats, Units in Combat, goes into some detail about how the F-14 was selected. In short, The Iranian air defense radar was a system that was not the best the U.S. could supply, and even when working at its best, the mountainous terrain bordering the USSR left large areas in the blind. Having been supplied confidential information on the capabilities of the Tomcat, you might surmise they were also being briefed on the F-15. And even if that weren't the case, the Iranian Procurement Board had already decided that the F-14 was the aircraft they wanted and needed in late 1971. Initially, one reason the Tomcat was selected was the AUG-9 radar and the Phoenix. But the radar also allowed for better target acquisition and better range for the Sparrow and Sidewinder missiles. The F-15 had nothing to match that. Probably more astounding in retrospect was that the Iranians, beside acquiring the F-14, had also intended to buy at least one E-3 AWACS aircraft and 2 satellites for their own very robust command, control, and communication system. This plan was ultimately to infill the blind spots in their ground-based radar. But the Iranians were playing their cards close to their chest while McDonnell Douglas and Grumman were falling all over themselves in anticipation of the fly-off and a payday. The Iranians played along, and an Iranian familiar with the process is quoted as saying, "It's totally naive to believe that a show organized for the Shah would make any reasonable and responsible person decide to spend billions," and goes on to say we knew better than to be influenced by the stunts of American pilots. And finishes with this: "We simply couldn't ignore the F-14. Its performance during the war with Iraq confirmed our decision beyond any doubt." With Khomeini referring to the U.S. as the Great Satan, it was clear that going forward the relationship between the U.S. and Iran would not be a smooth one. The Iran hostage crisis would serve as the exclamation point on the deterioration of the relationship. After 444 days of tensions, the dramatic failure of the rescue attempt, and the hostages' eventual return, the U.S. public was more than happy to put Iran in our collective rearview mirror. The U.S. government, however, didn't. The lingering animosity over the control and use of the Shatt al-Arab River and some very fundamental religious differences between Iraq and Iran would explode into the deadliest regional conflict between 2 regular armies of developing countries in the 20th century, when Iraq invaded Iran in September of 1980. At minimum, the conflict would cost 500,000 lives. Some estimates put the total over 2 million souls. The U.S. involvement in the war was, how do you say it? The Chinese say stepping on 2 boats, the Russians say sitting on 2 chairs. In other words, the U.S. played on both sides of the fence. The U.S. strategy was to prevent either side from winning decisively, fearing an Iranian victory would threaten regional stability and oil supplies. So, the U.S. would supply Iraq with significant intelligence, dual-use technology, and financial aid. For Iran, the Reagan administration, behind closed doors, devised a scheme to fund the Nicaraguan Contras fight with the Sandinistas by selling Iranians parts and weapons through back channels. The Iranian money then went to the Contras. For the Iranians, it kept the Tomcat healthy and flying. For the U.S., it introduced us to Oliver North, the Iran-Contra affair, and the subsequent hearings. For Reagan, a black eye. When war broke out between Iran and Iraq, the Iranians had 79 of the 80 F-14s they had purchased. They had received 274 of the 714 Phoenix missiles they had ordered. And from May of 1974, when the first group of 4 Iranian F-4 pilots arrived at Miramar for training until the fall of the Shah in 1979, 120 crew were fully trained and qualified, while an additional 100 were in the pipeline. Much of the training was carried out in the U.S. and Iran by American contractors. My father, ever so briefly, considered going to Iran to be one of those contractors. I was all for it and was all set to visit on my college breaks. But somewhere along the line, for reasons lost in the annals of time, he instead went into the corporate hallways of Grumman International and into the thrilling world of mail trucks and canoes. As my father flew at corporate desks, the U.S. sent offers through back channels to buy back the 79 Tomcats. Iran countered with a terse, "Where's the 80th F-14? We want what we paid for." The U.S. reply to that was to embargo all parts and equipment for the F-14 and any other American systems that the Iranians had. And as Grumman and Hughes employees left their desert oasis to return to the U.S., they had been instructed to sabotage as much as possible. That should have been it. The Iranians left to do their best to keep the Tomcats flying. 2 things would delay that day. 1, arms embargoes are as porous as a screen door. Too much money involved. Secondly, the aforementioned Iran-Contra scandal. Soon after taking office, the Reagan administration secretly and abruptly changed American policy and secretly began to supply Iran with critical spare parts for American-made weapons and additional weapons. This was all handled by the Israelis and brokered by Adnan Khashoggi. And, as the New York Times explained it, Israel was interested in keeping the war between Iran and Iraq going to ensure that these two potential enemies remained preoccupied with each other. So, for 8 years, Iran and Iraq slugged it out. It is not hard to understand how a nation can coalesce when it comes under attack from a foreign invader. It is very difficult to understand, however, when a vindictive, brutal regime like Iran comes under attack, and the same holds true. It held true for a regime that, in its short tenure in power, had executed and purged the loyalist Iranian military, and it saved some of those harshest punishments for the Shah's pilots. Yet, following the Iraqi invasion, the pilots that could return to their squadrons did, and on the second day of the war were able to carry out Operation Cayman 99, an operation that would launch nearly 200 aircraft to target Iraqi oil refineries, air bases, and other strategic installations to slow the advancing Iraqi invaders. As Lieutenant Colonel Mahdi Dadpeh is quoted as saying, "Well, gentlemen, we have been wearing these uniforms to serve Iran in such an hour. We have been trained for this moment." As the F-5s and F-4s stormed into Iraq, 60 Tomcats remained behind to protect Iranian airspace, where they were able to shoot down 2 MiG-21s and 3 MiG-23s. In one day, the Iranian Tomcat pilots had taken down as many aircraft as the U.S. Navy would in 32 years the aircraft was in its inventory. For the Iranian Tomcat pilots, this was just the beginning. My father went to war in anticipation that he would meet the enemy in a dogfight like the fighter pilots that had come before him. Would he cover himself with glory like Rickenbacker, like Bong, like Blesse? His one chance was foiled when, in his haste to chase down a MiG-21, he forgot to release his empty centerline fuel tank, some other stores, and could only manage a meager Mach 1.25. But after realizing his mistake, he would also realize that his prey was leading him and his wingmen straight over Hanoi. It was a trap. The only thing for him to do was pull back the throttles and find a tanker to get him back to the boat. Despite my father's failure to engage the enemy, American pilots would claim 195 North Vietnamese aircraft shot down, while the Vietnamese would claim that they lost only 134 aircraft in air-to-air combat during the conflict. These numbers pale in comparison to the numbers realized in the 3 major conflicts that preceded Vietnam. But in the aforementioned book by Tom Cooper and Farzad Bishop, the most comprehensive to date about the F-14 in the Iran-Iraq War, they compiled a list of aircraft down that included 159 aerial victories and 34 probable and unconfirmed. Complementing that list are the 16 Tomcats that the Iranians lost, and of those, only 3 were lost in air-to-air combat. Impressive numbers, even if true by half, but more revealing in the list compiled by Cooper and Bishop was the weapon used in each victory. When the F-4 Phantom made its debut, it had no internal gun. This was the result of several studies written in the late 50s that were sure that future air combat would consist of high-speed, long-range engagements between interceptors and bombers, and that air-to-air missiles would negate the need for a gun. The F-8, heralded as the last gunfighter, did have a gun, but as the abstract to Michael Weaver's paper, An Examination of the F-8 Crusader Through Archival Sources, states, the paper will examine the common claims that the F-8 was the last of the gunfighters, and shows that as per Navy tactical doctrine, its pilots actually used AIM-9 sidewinders as their primary weapon. And he states later in the paper that the F-8 was actually a missile-first fighter with guns. The F-4's lack of a gun would be bemoaned by many and only rectified in the Air Force E models. It was a mistake that the Navy and Air Force swore they would never make again. And with the F-14, the Navy didn't. So, it is interesting that the U.S. Navy's 5 F-14 kills were all with missiles, sidewinders, and Sparrows. This is not a large enough statistical pool to make any assumptions, but reviewing Cooper and Bishop's lists is far more revealing. Only one of the aerial victories they listed was accomplished with a gun, and that was to shoot down a helicopter. Granted, this is not an exhaustive investigation of the whys and the what-fors of each engagement, but this quick windshield survey points to the Tomcat's Vulcan cannon as being merely decoration. Like the F-8, perhaps the F-14 was actually a missile-first fighter with guns as well. But we'll leave that discussion for another day. We'll stop here and leave it to the next installment to review the Phoenix missile system. That missile and the F-14 were never tested in combat by the U.S. Navy. They were, however, used extensively by the Iranians in their war with the Iraqis through much of the 80s, and we'll take a deeper dive into that missile system in Installment 41. So, until next time, thanks for joining me for the 40th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate you all being along for the journey. So please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.